So we need to start by talking about a couple of things that we don't usually think about, much less talk about. The first is this, that for Paul, and for Paul's friends, and for Paul's community, and for Paul's people, and for the audience that Paul is writing to, God is obvious. And not just God, but the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God of the Exodus and the Promised Land, the God of the law and the prophets. And Paul is going to insist that even to other people, even to folks who aren't him and aren't his friends and aren't in his community and aren't in the audience that he is writing to, that God is obvious. And in fact, to other folks, to Romans and Greeks and Gentiles, the gods and the spirits and divine powers are obvious, even if they don't connect them to the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God of the Exodus and the Promised Land, the God of the law and the prophets. So when Paul starts talking about God, he is talking about something that to most people is in some way just part of how the world is. That is not the case for us today. We have gotten very used to an understanding of the world where God, or the gods, or divine power, or spirits, or whatever, is far from obvious, is in fact a little bit weird, a little bit strange, a little bit how can they believe in that sort of thing. So we have to, as we're reading Romans, kind of cross this divide. We have to get from a spot where we see belief in God as a choice and one that may not be all that common, to one where belief in God is a certainty, where God is obvious. The second thing is that if you remember last week, at the end of last week's reading here in Romans, Paul said that the gospel is God's saving power for all, the Jew first and then the Greek. So both Jews and Gentiles, but he used this word, saving. Christians talk about salvation a lot. We don't always use that word. Sometimes we use others. Liberation, redemption, restoration, repair, but we talk about the idea a lot. And whenever you say salvation, whenever you say save, the first question that springs to mind is saved from what? Saved from what danger? Liberated from what oppression? Redeemed from what captor? Restored from what injury? Repaired from what brokenness? And so Paul is launching into the answer to that question, and he is using, well, there's this thing, this genre of ancient literature or modern social media post called a vice catalog, or as I like to call it, a wine list. You can find several of these in Paul's letters. You can find still more in the New Testament. You can find still more in Christian writings outside of the Bible. And you can find still more in ancient writings by non-Christians. And you can find still more on Facebook or Twitter or the platform of your choice. These lists of what is wrong with the world. What do we need saved from? Here you go. I've got slides and bullet points and a whole TED Talk on how things are messed up. And Paul is giving us that list, or at least a list. It's different from some of the other lists, and we'll get to that in a sec. And we have to deal with this list. This is part of our scripture. How do we see how the world is messed up? Here it is in verse after verse. And right in the middle, right in the center, are a couple of those clobber verses that we are so familiar with. Those verses that attack members of the LGBTQ community, those verses that hurt people, those verses that are not something that is wrong with the world, at least not as they are often used. So I want to walk through this list just a little bit so we can get a picture of this list, so we can get an understanding of what Paul is saying. And I want to deal with those clobber verses and this entire list in three ways. The first one is actually pretty simple. This is a long list. This has a lot of things on it. And as Paul will remind us, once you have a wine list, once you have a list of vices, once you have a catalog of what is wrong with the world, you don't get to pick and choose. That is a statement that has been used at me, right? You don't get to pick and choose. You don't get to throw out the things. These clobber verses are on this list. You've got to take them. But if we take that seriously, if we take that idea seriously, then anybody who preaches those clobber verses has to also preach as loudly and passionately and vociferously against envy and deceit and gossip. And I guarantee almost nobody treats everything in this list with the same level of concern. Everybody takes bits out and makes things okay and tries to get along. And that is a weak way of dealing with those clobber verses. That is a weak way of dealing with this list. So there's a better one. It doesn't actually matter what is on the list. Paul's point is not what is on the list. You could make a wine list. You could make a wine list. You could make a wine list. I could make a wine list, and they would not all be the same. There might be some similarities, there might be some overlap, but there would be differences. We would identify different things. Some things that I put at the top, you might put at the bottom. Some things that you put at the top, somebody else might leave out entirely, and some things that you leave out, somebody else might put at the top. The point of the list is not to say here is an exhaustive catalog of everything that is wrong with the world, because this is not an exhaustive catalog of everything that is wrong with the world. This is some highlights from Paul's perspective. And because we are in a conversation with Paul, because we can be in a debate with Paul, because we can be in an argument with Paul, we can say to Paul, you got some things on your list wrong. You misunderstood some stuff. You didn't see the whole truth. So we have to revise the list. But that doesn't change the fact that it takes 30 seconds of looking around to notice that the world is in fact messed up. That there are in fact dangers that we need saving from, and oppressions that we need liberated from, and captors that we need redeemed from, and injury that we need restored from, and brokenness that we need fixed. We can disagree on exactly what that looks like. We can be searching for the list of things, but that does not change the reality that we face, that things are not what they could be, and that we need help. There's a third thing here. Paul is setting us up. Paul is in fact setting his audience up. Paul is setting the community in Rome that he is writing to up, because he is listing the things that to him and his friends and his community and his audience are the things that are obviously wrong with the world. He is saying, do you know what you need saved from? You need saved from those people. You need saved from the Gentiles. You need saved from the Greeks. You need saved from the Romans. You need saved from Rome, right where you live. All of these people who know that God is obvious in the back of their minds, who know that the God of Abraham and Isaac of Jacob, of the Exodus and the Promised Land, of the law and the prophets, is the one true God of the world, but who have turned away and who worship idols made of wood and stone, who have icky stuff going on, who are liars and slanderers and gossips and murderers and all of those things. You need to be saved from them. And his audience, hearing this letter, reading this letter, understanding this letter, are nodding along. You're right, Paul. They don't know God. They have turned away from God. And they are all messed up. And we need to be saved from them. And what Paul is about to do, and we'll talk about this some next week, but what Paul is about to do is this beautiful moment, this great moment, this I've got the audience nodding along with me moment where he says, you're right, they don't know God and they are doing the wrong things. You know God, so what is your excuse? You do all the same stuff that you don't like in others. You see what other folks are doing and you condemn it. You see what other folks are failing to do and you condemn it, and then you do the same things and you fail to do the same things. Everything that is written here about the brokenness of the world is also the brokenness of Paul and Paul's community and Paul's friends and the community in Rome, the people who he is writing to. It is the brokenness of the church. It is the brokenness of everything. And not one of us gets out of it. And so when we ask a question, like what do we need saved from? The answer isn't that we need saved from them. The answer is that we need saved from ourselves. We have tried again and again to make the lists, to find the vices, to figure out the stuff to whine about. We have tried again and again to save ourselves, only to find that nothing we have done has saved us. Nothing we have done has liberated us. Nothing we have done has redeemed or restored us. Nothing we have done has fixed us. It is simply not something that we can do on our own. We need hope. And Paul's answer to that is the good news that we don't have to rely on ourselves. We don't have to figure out the list. We don't have to figure out the rules. We don't have to get it all in order. Instead, we can put those things aside and rely on the grace of God. And by relying on the grace of God, we can be saved. We can be liberated. We can be redeemed, restored. We can be fixed. We can become the people who God has been calling us to be since the beginning. But in order to do that, we're going to have to put aside the lists and embrace love. To do that, we're going to have to stop looking out there and start looking in here. To do that, we're going to have to stop relying on ourselves and rely on God.